Why did Russia really sell Alaska? Today, it's one of the most resource-rich regions in the world, yet in 1867, the Russian Empire sold it to the United States for just $7.2 million. Was it a disastrous mistake, a desperate financial decision, or did the US never actually pay for Alaska at all? In this video, we'll separate fact from fiction, uncover the real reasons behind the sale, and see whether Russia made a wrong choice or whether, given the circumstances at the time, it was the only logical decision. Welcome to History for Lunch. Grab your lunch and let's uncover another fascinating story from history. Chapter 1. Russian Alaska. How Russia came to own America. To understand why Russia sold Alaska, we first need to understand what Alaska actually was. Long before it became the 49th state of the United States, Alaska was a remote frontier on the edge of the Russian Empire. Russian Emperor Peter the Great was determined to explore Russia's eastern frontier, and in 1732, Mikhail Gvozdev's expedition became the first Russian expedition to land on the Alaskan coast. From that point on, Russia officially claimed the territory. Alaska's waters were rich with fish, and its forests and coastline were home to some of the world's most valuable fur-bearing animals. That created the perfect conditions for a thriving fur trade with the Russian mainland. The Russian Empire established the Russian-American Company. It was granted a monopoly over trade and colonization in the region. The company purchased furs from indigenous hunters, exported them across the empire, and quickly became one of Russia's most successful commercial ventures. For decades, Alaska remained a profitable colonial possession. So the question rises, why did Russia decide to sell such a good source of profit? Chapter 2. Reasons for selling Alaska. By the middle of the 19th century, the foundations of colonial success were beginning to crumble. It's worth remembering that at this point, Alaska's future wealth was still completely unknown. The great gold discoveries were decades away, and the famous gold rush hadn't even begun. As far as Russia was concerned, Alaska's true treasure was walking along its coastline in the form of sea otters and other fur-bearing animals. The entire economy of Russian America depended on the fur trade. The problem was that hunters had become too successful. Russian merchants, together with local hunters, harvested sea otters so aggressively that their population collapsed. By the 1850s, the industry that had made Alaska profitable was rapidly disappearing. Russian-American Company, which had once been one of the empire's most successful enterprises, was now bankrupt. Competition from independent merchants broke its monopoly, while years of overhunting had left fewer and fewer valuable pelts to sell. Moreover, as time went on, supply chains became less efficient, pricing policies deteriorated, and commercial decisions were increasingly made by people with little experience in commerce because Alaska was now run by officers and bureaucrats. At the same time, the Russian Empire was expanding rapidly along the Pacific coast of Asia. These territories were easier to reach, easier to defend, and directly connected to the Russian mainland. Alaska, by contrast, looked increasingly isolated. Supplying the colony required ships to cross enormous distances, and every year it became harder to justify the expense. Food shortages became a recurring problem because the settlements couldn't produce everything they needed. Much of their food had to be imported, but the American Civil War disrupted regional trade, making supplies even more difficult to obtain. There was another growing concern. American settlers and prospectors were steadily moving north. While Russia formally owned Alaska, the United States was expanding at an astonishing pace. It had already acquired Louisiana from France and vast territories from Mexico, and many Russian officials believed it was only a matter of time before Alaska became the next target. In 1853, the Governor-General of Eastern Siberia, Count Nikolai Muravyov-Amursky, warned the emperor that Russia would eventually lose Alaska if it tried to hold on to it. The colony was no longer economically valuable, it was almost impossible to defend, and if war ever broke out with the United States or Britain, sending reinforcements across the Pacific would be a logistical nightmare. His conclusion was remarkably straightforward. Instead of pouring resources into a vulnerable colony across the ocean, Russia should strengthen its position on the Asian Pacific coast. Even still, the biggest reason for selling Alaska lay somewhere else. Between 1853 and 1856, Russia fought the Crimean War against an alliance that included Britain and France. The war ended in a humiliating defeat, leaving the empire financially exhausted. The treasury was running a massive deficit, and the government was forced to seek tens of millions of rubles in foreign loans just to stabilize the country's finances. Every major expenditure was now being reconsidered. Suddenly, selling Alaska looked quite reasonable. One of the strongest supporters of this view was Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, the younger brother of Tsar Alexander II. In 1857, he argued that Russia shouldn't deceive itself. The United States, he wrote, was steadily expanding across North America and would eventually take Alaska, whether through diplomacy or by force. If that outcome seemed inevitable, why not sell the territory while it still had value? Alexander II took the proposal seriously. By late 1866, the question was no longer whether Alaska should be sold. It was how. On December 16th, Alexander II gathered his closest advisors for the final discussion. Among those present was Russia's minister to Washington, Eduard de Stukel. He brought an important reality check that the Americans weren't exactly eager to buy Alaska. Many politicians saw it as an enormous frozen wilderness with little economic value. If Russia wanted to make a deal, it would have to convince both Congress and the American public that Alaska was worth acquiring. That meant the hardest part of the entire process was only just beginning. Selling Alaska required diplomacy, persuasion, and, as we'll soon see, more than a little political maneuvering. And that's where one of the most controversial chapters in the story begins. Chapter 3. The Sale, the Myths, and Where the Money Went. Alexander II authorized Stukel to negotiate the sale. His initial instructions were surprisingly modest. Russia was prepared to accept $5 million, a figure considered reasonable for the time. For comparison, the United States had purchased the vast Louisiana territory for $15 million just over 60 years earlier. Even so, many Americans opposed the purchase. Newspapers mocked the proposal, describing Alaska as a frozen wasteland inhabited by little more than Eskimos and seals. Critics argued that the United States had no need for another remote, expensive territory. To them, the entire deal looked like a waste of taxpayer money. Stukel, however, proved to be a remarkably skilled negotiator. Working closely with Secretary of State William H. Seward, one of the deal's strongest supporters, he helped build political support in Washington. Historical records also show that around $120,000 was spent influencing senators and members of the press, a practice that would be highly controversial today but was far from unusual in 19th century politics. On March 30th, 1867, the treaty was signed. On October 18th, the Russian flag was lowered, the American flag was raised, and Alaska officially became part of the United States in exchange for $7.2 million in gold. Then came perhaps the biggest myth of all. Many people still believe Russia never received the money. According to one popular story, the gold sank aboard a ship on its way to St. Petersburg. Another claims corrupt officials pocketed the payment. Others insist Alaska wasn't sold at all, that it was merely leased for 99 years and should have been returned in the 20th century. None of these stories hold up. While Stukel did spend around $120,000 on lobbying and political influence, the remaining money reached the Russian government. Rather than sitting in the treasury, much of it was used to purchase equipment for one of the empire's biggest infrastructure projects, the expansion of Russia's railway network, including lines connecting Moscow, Ryazan, Kyiv, and Kursk. Financially, the sale didn't transform Russia overnight. The empire's annual budget measured in the hundreds of millions of rubles, so the payment represented only a small fraction of total government spending. But at a time when Russia faced a serious budget deficit after the Crimean War, it provided welcome relief. Still, one question remained unanswered. Did Russia make the right decision? Chapter 4. Was selling Alaska actually a mistake? Looking back today, it's easy to say Russia made one of the worst deals in history. Just 13 years after the sale, prospectors discovered rich gold deposits in Alaska. Then came the famous gold rush, drawing thousands of fortune seekers north. By the 20th century, Alaska had become one of America's leading producers of gold, and that wasn't the end of it. Even more valuable resources were still waiting underground. Huge oil and natural gas reserves were discovered across the territory, transforming Alaska into one of the most strategically important states in the United States. Today, it ranks among America's largest oil producers, while its mines supply a significant share of the world's zinc. By the early 20th century alone, Alaska had already generated many times the $7.2 million the United States had paid for it. With hindsight, it seems like an incredible bargain. But hindsight can be deceptive. In the end, the sale of Alaska was a calculated geopolitical decision made under very different circumstances than the ones we know today. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the story, and until next lunch.